going to do in this session is focus mainly on democracy as it applies to debating, because I think we all have a fairly, at least rudimentary knowledge of politics and the way things work, particularly in Australia, from civics classes and our various exposure to the awful news media that we consume constantly. So, if I do skip over anything that you think is unclear or should be explained, please do tell me. I'll also be using some topics that have been used in various competitions, and we'll be prepping them, well, not prepping them, but we'll be discussing them as a group. So, be prepared to speak. It's going to be one of those sessions. Finally, there'll also be a reasonably heavy focus on comparing the USA and Australia. A, because I was asked to do that, and B, because it's very interesting to compare a barely functioning democracy with a totally broken democracy. So we'll do that too. So very briefly, political leaders, and the broad difference here between the US and Australia is the way they're chosen. So basically in Australia, of course, each party, the members of each party, being the elected members, choose the leader of the party by various ballots, and we've seen the way that gets reported in terms of leadership spills and things like that in the past. The interesting trend to keep aware of in terms of Australian politics is the rise of presidential style politics. So I've written that isn't necessarily how the voters see it, because increasingly there's a trend for people like the man on the street, not us politically informed actors, but Joe Q, Queensland, to kind of think, oh, well, I voted for Kevin Rudd, or I'm voting for Julia Gillard, that kind of thing, rather than I'm voting for the Labour Party, I'm voting for the Liberal Party. So it's important to keep that difference in perception, and I think it's one that's increasing in mind when you do debates about whether to reform electoral systems. In the USA, things are a bit more complicated in a couple of ways. So rather than having candidates pre-selected by parties, so chosen by the kind of faceless men in the party executive and those kinds of people, they're often primary elections. So the candidate for a particular seat, like your MP, which they would call a congressman, is chosen by a ballot that anyone can vote in, as long as they're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, or in some states, if they're anyone at all. So in this case, the voter gets more influence about, or more influence over, who the party actually selects. The other key difference is that the executive is directly elected. So when a voter in the US goes to vote in a presidential election, that usually coincides with the federal election, they vote for their congressman and their senator, their state senators, but they also vote directly for the President of the United States. So those with, identity disorders could in theory vote for a Democratic congressman and a Republican president. And indeed, you can end with that kind of outcome. So this is the kind of thing that can lead to political stalemates in the US. So most commonly this is where the president is of one particular party, but the Congress and or the Senate are controlled by a majority of a different party. The most common time when this happens is after midterm elections, because the president is elected every 4 years. There are federal elections for various numbers of seats every 2 years. So half the time they coincide, but in the middle of every president's term, there's another election. And often presidents aren't especially popular halfway through their terms because of the challenges of being president and trying to get things done in a functionally broken system. So this kind of friction can lead to various things that are on a scale of dramatic to not dramatic. The most dramatic is the government shutdown that we all remember from season 5 of The West Wing. But which has happened, in real life, and I think Newt Gingrich was responsible for one of them at some point. Basically, in order for the government to keep operating, the budget has to be passed so that employees can be paid, federal employees can be paid, and so on. If the parties can't agree on how to finalise that, it gets a bit messy, but basically federal workers just stay home for a little while, usually a couple of days, until things are resolved. So it's a kind of mutually assured destruction type tactic, because the ultimate compromise usually makes no one happy, but as a rule it tends to favour the kind of conservative position, because the kind of compromise budget that you end up with when things are really dire and you have to actually get a solution is usually the kind of budget that doesn't include a whole lot of new spending or other progressive things that progressive people like. It's more about just getting things back on track or keeping them the way they were, by and large. So, political systems. So, in terms of the separation of powers, so basically, as we all know, there are 3 branches of most parent governments, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Where the legislature creates the laws, the judiciary arbitrates the laws, and the executive responsible for executing the laws and day-to-day administration and various other things. And on the eve of Anzac Day, they're also importantly responsible for commanding the armed forces of the country. In Australia, the separation between the executive and the legislature is a little bit weak because the executive, the cabinet, the prime minister, and so on, also sit in parliament. So the ability for oversight to be exercised there is diminished, but the judiciary remains kind of fiercely independent. In the USA, it's much clearer because the president obviously is directly elected and isn't part of the Congress. So there's a much clearer separation. The difficulty in the US, and to some degree with other courts in other countries, is the politicization of the judiciary. So in the US, Supreme Court justices are elected for life until they die or retire, basically. A lot of them choosing to hang on and so that they can either die or retire during a favourable president, like Senator O'Connor, who refused to retire until a Republican was in office. The problem with this is that you tend to end up with the justices being divided along fiercely partisan lines. So, of course, various justices have reputations as being conservative or progressive, with a couple of swing voices. The most conservative are Scalia and Alito, I think, at the moment. So, a topic that was run at Australs last year was that the US should directly elect Supreme Court justices. Why would we do that? That wasn't a rhetorical question.
Keep the judiciary accountable?
Yes. How?
By the same way you keep the Congress accountable, you can vote them out of office.
Good. Okay. So we get the voters more directly involved in making the judiciary accountable. What are problems with doing that? Yes.
Politicize them, so like they're more involved with those things than what they actually should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you politicise the judiciary when you basically have them elected. And you can see examples of this in the US as well, where many kind of small-town sheriffs and magistrates are elected, and they're running various, to be honest, quite strange election campaigns, where they'll show off how badly they're treated prisoners at the local county jail to keep costs down and things like that. So you end up basically turning the judiciary into a very political body, and that's not necessarily a good thing, because the interests of having the laws interpreted fairly don't necessarily align with what voters would want to vote for every 2 or 4 years or whatever. To look at some smaller issues from either country. In Australia, we have proportional representation for part of our election. So for the Senate, for example, the number of seats the party gains is proportional to their vote within the state, which differs from the United States, where they have the Electoral College, which basically is complicated and mostly outmoded, but amounts to a winner-take-all system. So it's important to keep in mind the differences between different styles of representation. So proportional representation is usually better for minor parties, who would struggle to win a whole seat on their own, but could perhaps achieve some small percentage of the proportional votes, like the Greens, for example. Filibusters are an interesting feature of all parliamentary political systems, but particularly in the US, their use has evolved. So the filibuster is basically where a senator, I believe they're only using senators, but I could be wrong, a senator can delay a vote by basically talking for as long as they like, and they can often, tag team and things like that to basically delay votes and force compromises rather than allowing votes to proceed. And the original intention of these kinds of things was, so that on very important issues, people would delay votes, but they're started to be used very routinely in the US Senate, which basically means that in order to get anything done in the Senate, a party requires what's referred to as a filibuster-proof majority. So the 60 seats in the Senate, or maybe 61, that are required to effectively force a cloture motion to end the discussion on an issue. So I think it's hard to speak very strongly in favour of filibusters, but there's certainly a feature of the US political system that I think it makes it reasonably broken. citizen-initiated referenda, or initiatives as they're called in the US, they're very popular in the United States. I think roughly half the states have provisions for these. Basically, the premise of these is that a group of citizens can gather signatures. If they get a certain number, 5,000, 1,000, whatever, they can put an issue to a ballot, and it will be voted on at the same time as a parliamentary election. So examples of these are the very famous Proposition 8 in California that sought to ban same-sex marriage. And there are also things that run from the mundane, like extra taxes to fund library services, and various other little things like that. There are two kinds. There can be direct or indirect. So in states that allow direct initiatives, it means that the result of the vote is binding, and that people can, that the law must be implemented if they vote in favour of it, or indirect, which is just kind of holds plebiscites to kind of guide the legislature on the views of the public. The other interesting use is often to kind of promote legalisation of marijuana, and you see that in Washington State, although not yet with success, to my knowledge. In terms of minority government, which is, I think, an Australian issue at present, as I'm sure we're all aware, I won't speak at length about this because we're all intimately familiar with the result of that situation. And you'll see that this was debated very recently at the Easters in Canberra, where the motion was that Australia should require governments to achieve a parliamentary majority before they're able to govern. Why do you think that might be a good idea? Yes?
So as not to give independent candidates like undue power?
Absolutely, yeah. So that was exactly what we saw at the most recent federal election, where a handful of independents ended up with a great amount of ability to influence the course of politics. There's some other problems too, like, basically lack of stability and a vast increased amount of horse trading that you see politically. Why might it be a good thing? If you were negative on that topic, what might you say? Yes,
minority voices deserve to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. That our parliamentary system exists the way it does to allow all kinds of voices to be heard, and that the people are entitled to have their elected member exercise their influence in that way.
You could try and underplay the topic if you want to say that it's very unclear what a parliamentary majority would actually be. So if a parliamentary majority is just kind of a majority of the votes commanded, then it would be hard to say the current government doesn't have a parliamentary majority. If you wanted to say parliamentary majority is one party having it, then why should Liberals and Nationals be able to be in a coalition?
Yeah, I think a reasonable interpretation of the topic would preclude just saying any form of majority vote is a majority, therefore all parliaments are capable of majority governance. It's probably, I think, stretching the definition slightly. But you're right, you need to be careful about not excluding the coalition when setting up the debate. Okay. How long do I have, by the way?
No, you have 20 minutes.
Okay, excellent. Representation. So, of course, there are different styles of democracy and different ways in which democratic systems can work. The most common, and the one that we generally mean when we say democracy, is representative democracy, where we elect people who represent our views and our interests to the Parliament. The balancing things here in terms of how much you change here are balancing participation, so the ability of people to actually access the processes that govern their lives, deliberation, so that the idea that people the evidence should be properly considered before decisions are made, and equality, where everyone has equal kind of access in terms of making decisions. There are of course, other considerations in democracy. So I think most people would agree that governments have a pretty strong role in protecting minority groups, even though there might be majority will for doing so. It's important here to look at arguments like, you'll find kinds of arguments that are needed, where you talk about limiting democracy in order to protect democracy, which sounds very Orwellian, but basically this is about ensuring equality. So if people are exercising democratic freedom would interfere with someone else's access to or equal participation in democracy, that's probably a kind of right that might need to be curtailed, or you might argue needs to be curtailed, in order to protect everyone's access to democracy. So it can get messy, but it's important to keep in mind that democracy is more than just about like following the rules of democracy. It's also about making sure that the outcomes of like participation, equality, and deliberation are also achieved, and weighing up the ways in which these influence each other. So we'll look at two recent motions here. One from Wales at the start of the year, where this House supports politicians who pass progressive legislation, even where it's contrary to the wishes of the Democratic electorate. What would you say in favour?
Sometimes people might not want something that's in their long-term interests because it goes against their short-term interests.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an example of the importance of deliberation in democracy. So people don't necessarily deliberate very hard before making instinctive judgments about the rights of, say, black people or something like that. But the role of the elected representatives there is to make sure that all the evidence is weighed and they're able to make functioning and well deliberated decisions. So in some ways, the role of the representatives there is to make sure that deliberation aspect happens, rather than just going via the everyone's participated and made a gut judgment in order to achieve things there. Why wouldn't you support this motion? Yeah.
Because the whole point of democracy is the voice of the people. If people don't want it, then it should be going.
Yeah, absolutely. So ultimately, government exists to serve the people that it represents, and if their view doesn't support certain progressive ideals, then maybe they shouldn't have them imposed on them. Another motion from Easters earlier in the year about whether the government should allow conscience votes on issues of moral controversy. So in Australia, by and large, parties vote along party lines, which is enforced strictly on the Labour Party side and more informally in terms of the Liberals. On certain issues, the party can order a conscience vote where each member can vote according to their conscience, or in theory according to their conscience, and not have any repercussions for not sticking with party lines. That is a good thing for democracy. What would you say if you were the AF?
Yeah, you elect a representative, you elect their views.
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole point of representative democracy is that you choose someone to represent you, and in so doing, they therefore allow you to represent your view more accurately rather than being constrained along party lines. How would you oppose this?
People are elected on their platforms, which are conveyed by their party policies, and you might be going completely contrary to your electorate if you vote on your personal beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. So just allowing conscience votes gives far more certainty about the outcome of a vote for a particular individual or party. Good. Okay. Let's just sign a question, which I'll skip over. So we're looking at influence now, the influences on political systems. Lobbying. Lobbying is kind of a broad term, but more generally we mean professional lobbyists, so groups that band together in order to seek political influence by getting the ear and sometimes giving various financial inducements or other little goodies to politicians to get influence. Lobbying isn't always bad. Like people often just presume in arguments that lobbyist influence is just a bad thing in and of itself, which it's not, right? Like, it's an important part of making sure people get represented in political systems. And it's not always about people doing it, right? Like, people we like do it as well. Like, gays lobby to get married, and, refugee advocates lobby for better asylum seeker policies, and, even if you're some kind of xenophobic social fascist, like, people still lobby for the dairy industry not to be deregulated. So people lobby for things that we like as well. It's not just a kind of evil thing that only tobacco companies do, which is important to keep in mind. So if you have a debate about regulating or stopping lobbying, you do need to explain why lobbying is bad, or why, in your view, lobbying is a bad thing that you need to table, because often people just take it for granted rather than starting with that. In terms of regulation, there are a couple of attempts. So in Australia, we now have kind of lobbyist register where people must sign in if they're going to visit Parliament with the intention of influencing a minister for their cause, which is fine. And Obama's attempted to do similar things with a couple of bills that have recently passed in the US. The question here, of course, is whether transparency or knowing who's being lobbied is enough to mitigate the undue influence that lobbyists might have. Because the problem people often think about when they think of lobbying being evil and bad is that people with money tend to get heard more than people without money, which kind of is a problem. So some say that you can mitigate this problem and regulate it by making sure it's very transparent. The other aspect of lobbying is this kind of incestuous relationship between lobbyists and politicians. So people often talk like the revolving door of lobbyists and politicians and things like that. Like so a lot of politicians will go on to become lobbyists, and a lot of the lobbyists will end up working on people's political staff. So it's a kind of intricate network of influence that isn't necessarily accountable and isn't necessarily democratic. I'll skip the topic for now just to get things moving. Just endorsements. So often there'll be non-political actors who end up having some kind of influence over people's vote or over people's views of politics. So, for example, religious leaders, celebrities, and so on vote hologram Tupac and so on. There's often groups that vote on blocks. So people in a megachurch, for example, in the same megachurch, are likely to vote in very similar ways, particularly if influence is being exercised by their, I don't know what they call it, but I guess megachurch captain.
Pastor.
Pastor, thank you. Of course, regulating this kind of thing is a thorny issue because people's right to speech is balancing against people's right to have equal participation, not be forced out of political processes by these huge blocks. So the grand final of Sydney Media last year was that this House would prohibit religious institutions from endorsing or promoting candidates for public office. If you were AF, what would you say?
People are getting misled by the link between religion and politics, which isn't inherent.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a crossover between the political sphere and the religious sphere that isn't necessarily conducive to good outcomes for people. Yeah, good. What would you say against it, do you think?
They're allowed to express an opinion just as you're allowed to express the contrary opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So regardless of the consequences, we don't limit people's speech. I think it's a fair line to take in that debate. In terms of the media, there are a couple of ways in which the media is important in terms of democracy. So obviously we have issues of influence. So when Rupert Murdoch owns a large proportion of media outlets in a particular country, the views of Rupert Murdoch, either directly or indirectly, tend to gain more prominence in the media. So there are often debates about regulating the maximum number of outlets that a particular person or company can own, and these are aimed at increasing the diversity of views that we see. That's kind of a media debate, but it's also relevant to democracy. In terms of media access, basically empirically there's a very strong correlation between the amount of money that you spend on a campaign and your success in that campaign. The kind of prime example of that is Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York City, who has spent lots of money to buy himself the mayorship and also remove term limits so he can be the mayor forever. And it's kind of a high-profile example. But the important thing here is that even if everyone has an intrinsic right to access media, their ability to exercise that is influenced by how much money they have and how much commercials they're able to buy and robocalls they're able to make and things like that. I'll talk more about money a bit later when we talk about the campaign funding. It's a media consumption. I give this just a bit of a background because a lot of political debates about the United States will kind of turn on the characterization of the way the public operates. So these aren't necessarily arguments in and of themselves, but it's an interesting background about how the media landscape in the US is changing. So there's an increasing trend towards a couple of things. Firstly, kind of self-selection of sources. So people, and this has been confirmed by some recent studies, actively seek out only that kind of news which they already agree with. So people who have very conservative leanings will tend to seek out only Fox and be quite resistant to other forms of media. And that drives the second thing, which is the kind of polarization of media in the US, particularly in the US, and I think to some extent elsewhere in the world. So you'll see news organisations increasingly being divided along partisan lines, and with content designed to appeal to particular people's views, rather than to inform them more broadly or to even be accurate. The other things are the kind of more general, like old people complaints about media, like the sell sound bites and the news cycle's so fast now, which is true, and also means that it's much harder for the deliberative aspect of democracy to come across in the news media, because people are always looking for fast sound bites and making sure that people are interested rather than being informed. And that's kind of the changing media cycle. So an interesting topic at Worlds last year was that this has to prevent politicians from making fact claims, I think factual claims, that, while not technically lies, are substantially misleading to voters. And like this obviously is a kind of media influence here. What would you say in favour of this? The Chatterbox Club?
Need to inform people in an accurate fashion over and above sort of saying stuff as soon as possible. They could just more or less the importance of accuracy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the topic wants you to kind of recognise the increasing role of media in setting reality and the way the politicians are able to manipulate this by kind of creating what becomes fairly misleading sound bites, knowing that there isn't that strong deliberative aspect anymore. What would you say against it?
The politicians should be entitled to say whatever they want, to have a frank discussion of issues and maybe problems with voters, so maybe there's some other way we should attack the problem.
Yeah, okay, so that it's more problematic to restrict politician speech, I think is absolutely a fair response. In terms of funding, well, some of the restrictions which I think we know about, so political statements to be authorised, there's a blackout on media before campaigns. The funding aspect I think is more interesting. In Australia, our public funding model is that you receive money after the election for based on the number of votes that the party received, the number of first preference votes the party received. I think it's roughly around $20 million each for the major parties at the moment for a federal election, based on the number of votes. And the parties can also solicit donations and use those. In the US, public funding is available at a kind of donation matching level, but with a cap. So politicians either opt into public funding or opt out. If they opt in, they get federal money that matches their donations up to a certain level, but they can't spend more than what's in modern times a reasonably low amount. Or they can opt out, not receive public funding, raise whatever they like and spend all of it. So you might guess the reality, which is that most politicians now do the latter, which they opt out and just rely entirely on private funding and donations. The interesting recent development is the rise of the super PAC. So the PAC, or PAC, is a political action committee. And in the US there are various different categories of them, some of them linked to candidates, some not. And they all used to have fairly reasonable restrictions on total spending and on their affiliations with candidates. A recent Supreme Court ruling, the Citizens United ruling, the same one that tells corporations and people they have a right to unlimited speech and things like that, there's just the super PAC, which is a PSC that can raise basically unlimited funds and use those for any kind of political advertising it wants. The condition is that they can't be affiliated to a candidate, but in practice, of course, all the super PACs will just tend to run ads that favour a certain candidate or are opposed to all other candidates. So this is an interesting new development in the broken democracy of the United States, and I think we'll be seeing the influence of that in the upcoming elections in terms of increasing negative campaigning, because once you have all the money, you can run whatever you like. And of course there are various conspiracy theories about just how tightly related they are to various candidates. We'll skip the topic again just so we can keep moving. Okay. Is democracy always the best medicine? Maybe, maybe not. You can look at it in various ways that other states, like non-Western democracies, are democratic or undemocratic. So in Singapore, for example, the guided democracy where the country's democratic in name, but in practice the PAP will run everything and will basically continue to do so for the foreseeable future. But this is in the name of stability and good results for the country. So there are kind of democracies in name and non-democracies that emulate democracies, and a whole spectrum right through to dictatorships and the countries that don't really pretend democracy. Although a North Korean man once said to me, we do have three parties in North Korea. The They all work together. So I think there are various differences there. I won't go through this in much detail. The California debacle is the opposite end of the spectrum, so is too much democracy bad? And the situation in California, in terms of the budget, is quite fucked, basically, because the voters, using direct initiatives and the power that gave them, passed an initiative requiring the legislature to have, I think, a three-quarter majority before they could pass any kind of law that would require increased taxation. So California is basically stuck with 1970s era levels of funding, trying to cope with 2012 problems. So they have like 9,999 problems, I guess you might say. We'll conclude by talking, I don't know where that came from. We'll conclude by talking about whether you characterize political actors. So the last stuff is just some background that's important to kind of think about and keep in mind when you form your arguments. There aren't really arguments, but there are important factors that influence the way you construct arguments. And that's important because in debates about political systems and democracy, the way that you characterize people, the way that you characterize different actors is really important. And that's how you kind of win and lose debates. So be really careful about the way that you approach these. And make sure you draw on a variety of influences. So think really clearly in your prep time and during the debate about all the different influences that act on both people within political parties and the public themselves. The other important thing I want to mention here is the importance of making sure that you recognise diversity within stakeholder groups. And this is a principle that extends far beyond political debates. So often you'll just kind of think, women are a stakeholder, and I'll just talk about them. But within within a group of women, obviously, not all women are the same, and there are often really important divisions that you can cleave between groups of people within a stakeholder group. And this is like obviously very important in political debates, where minorities need to be represented under the kind of sub-stakeholder of the public. So I think it's really important to make sure that you always think carefully about how to divide things up in stakeholder groups. And then, of course, explain why the public will respond the way that you assert their will. Because often debates about policy become, the public are benefited in this way and they will do this, with no explanation of why the public will actually behave in a certain way. So make sure you really analyse very carefully the influence on them. And be sure to shine light on the influence of invisible actors, like lobbyists, who aren't so obvious and intuitively part of the debate, but whose influence, nonetheless, you should consider when you're characterising political actors. All right, we have 3 minutes for questions. Or we have 3 minutes to chat before the toy release. All right, thank you.